Tyler, a young black boy, walked down the street alone. The rain had just begun to fall, and the streetlights cast a pale glow on the wet pavement. His steps echoed in the silence, but there was a sense of pride in his heart that made him feel warm despite the chill in the air. He had just finished a major school event that day and everything had gone perfectly. The applause from the audience still rang in his ears as he thought about the performance he had given. Tyler's father, Marcus, had braided his hair earlier that day before the event, something they always did for special occasions. It wasn't just a hairstyle to Tyler, it was a symbol of the love and care his father had for him. Marcus had spent hours getting the braids just right, making sure everything was perfect for his son's big day. Tyler remembered how his father had smiled at him in the mirror that morning and said, "This hair is your crown, Tyler. Tonight you're going to shine." The pride in his heart grew with every step he took, and he felt like a king walking home with his head held high. His father had always supported him, encouraged him, and made him feel like he could accomplish anything. But that feeling of pride started to fade when Tyler heard the hum of an approaching engine. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a patrol car slowly pulling up beside him. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement, cutting through the still night like a warning. Tyler's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the sudden presence of the police made him uneasy. The patrol car came to a stop and Tyler paused in his tracks. The officer inside rolled down the window and a woman's voice called out. "Hey, stop right there," the officer ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. Tyler's stomach tightened as he froze. He hadn't expected this, not after such a perfect day. He stood still, his hands at his sides as the officer stepped out of the car. The officer was tall, with short cropped hair and a stern expression. She looked him over, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. Tyler felt her gaze lingering on his hair, and he shifted uncomfortably. The officer didn't smile. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" she asked. Tyler's heart was pounding in his chest. "I just finished a school event at Madison High," he replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm walking home, ma'am." The officer didn't seem to care about his explanation. Instead, her eyes narrowed as she took another look at him. Tyler could feel the tension in the air, a growing sense of suspicion that he couldn't understand. "That hairstyle looks gang-related," the officer muttered under her breath. Her tone was dismissive, as if she had already made up her mind about him. Tyler stood there, stunned. "Ma'am, it's just a braid. My dad did it for me this morning. It's not gang-related." But the officer didn't listen. She stepped closer to him, her boots making a loud sound as they hit the wet pavement. "I'm going to need to see some ID," the officer demanded, her voice cold. "Don't try to tell me it's not gang-related. I know better." Tyler felt his chest tighten. He hadn't done anything wrong, but this officer was making him feel like a criminal just because of his hair. "Ma'am, please," Tyler said, trying to stay calm. "I'm just walking home. I'm not doing anything wrong. Why are you?" "Don't play games with me," the officer interrupted, her tone icy. "You think I don't know what I'm looking at?" Tyler swallowed hard. He could feel the tears threatening to come, but he didn't want to cry. Not in front of her. Not over something so unfair. His heart was racing and he couldn't understand why this officer was treating him like this. His father had spent so much time making sure he looked his best for today, and now it felt like all of that care was being thrown away. "I didn't do anything wrong," Tyler said, trying to explain, but his voice shook. He took a step back, hoping the officer would understand, but instead she moved even closer. She reached out, grabbing his bag and pulling it from his shoulder. Tyler winced, feeling helpless. She was treating him like a suspect, and all he wanted was to go home. "Let's go," the officer said as she began to pull him toward her car. "You're coming with me." Tyler didn't know what to do. He didn't want to resist, but this wasn't right. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just wanted to go home. The rain began to fall harder, making everything blur around him. His white shirt clung to his body, and his hair, once neatly braided, now felt heavy as the rain soaked through. He could barely keep his eyes open, the water streaming down his face, mixing with the tears he refused to shed. But then, just as the officer was about to force him into the car, a voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" Tyler turned his head, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. Standing at the end of the street was his father, Marcus. Tyler's face lit up, and a sense of relief washed over him. His dad was here. Marcus walked quickly toward them, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He was a man of authority in the city, someone who was always in control. "What are you doing to my son?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but full of power. The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected this. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. "You will release him immediately." The officer's eyes widened in recognition. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Marcus was not just any man. He was well known, respected, and had connections that no one would dare mess with. I didn't know," the officer stammered, but Marcus didn't let her finish. "Whatever you thought you were doing here," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing, "you just made a mistake. And you'll regret it." The officer stood frozen, realizing the gravity of her error. Marcus turned to Tyler, his voice softening as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's go home, son," Marcus said, his tone warm and reassuring. "This is over." As they walked away, Marcus made sure to leave a lasting impression on the officer. It was clear that his actions would have consequences, and Tyler knew that everything would be okay now that his father was there. But Tyler's thoughts were still heavy. As he walked home, he couldn't help but wonder, why did it take his father's power for someone to see the truth? Why did his hair, something so personal and meaningful, have to be judged like this? Tyler stood there, shocked and confused. The officer's words felt like a slap in the face, and he struggled to understand how his simple hairstyle could make her so suspicious. Officer Turner's cold eyes stared him down, narrowing as she sized him up. "That hairstyle looks gang-related," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Tyler to hear. Tyler's heart dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His braids weren't a symbol of anything negative, they were a part of his identity, something his father, Marcus, had carefully braided that morning before his big event. "No, ma'am," Tyler said, trying to keep his voice steady. "These braids are from my dad. He did them for me this morning. It's just a style. It's not gang-related." But Officer Turner wasn't listening. She seemed determined to prove that something was wrong, and Tyler couldn't understand why. He had done nothing to deserve this. He was just a kid, walking home from his event, minding his own business. Why was she acting like this? "Don't play games with me, boy," Officer Turner snapped, her voice growing more harsh. "You think I don't know what gang signs look like? You think you can walk around like this, looking like trouble and not get noticed?" Tyler's chest tightened. He felt a wave of panic rising in him. He was terrified and confused, but he refused to let his fears show. "I'm just a student," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer ignored him and stepped closer. She didn't care about his explanation or the truth. Tyler was starting to realize that this wasn't about him at all. It was about her assumptions, her prejudices, and her need to prove something. She didn't care that he was a model student, that he had just performed in front of a crowd that applauded him. She didn't care about his father's hard work, or how his hair had been braided out of love and care. Without saying another word, Officer Turner reached for his bag, yanking it from his shoulder. Tyler jumped back, his heart racing even faster. He wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't right, but he couldn't find the words. The officer was already pulling out her handcuffs, the cold metal shining in the dim light of the street. She grabbed his arm roughly, pushing him toward her patrol car. "Let me go," Tyler shouted, struggling against her grip, but it was useless. Her handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a final chilling sound. "You're coming with me," Officer Turner said, her voice filled with authority. "If you cooperate, this won't be as bad." Tyler felt the tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, but he fought them back. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him cry. He tried to stay calm, to think of his father, who would be there soon, but the fear and humiliation were starting to eat away at him. His night, which had started so beautifully, was being torn apart piece by piece. Officer Turner shoved him into the back of the patrol car, and Tyler sat there in stunned silence, still trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was this happening? Why did his hair, something so personal and meaningful, make him a target? As the car sped toward the station, Tyler's thoughts were racing. He wanted to cry out for help, but he knew that wouldn't change anything. The officer had already made up her mind. He was a troublemaker just because of his braids. When they arrived at the station, Tyler was led through the cold, dim hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. His thoughts were everywhere. His father, the concert he had just performed in, the pride he had felt in his accomplishments. Now it all felt so far away. "Sit down," Officer Turner commanded as she pushed him into a chair. Tyler's eyes were wide with fear. He could feel the anger and embarrassment building up inside of him, but he kept his mouth shut. He didn't want to make the situation worse. The officer walked away for a moment, and Tyler noticed other officers in the station, some of them looking at him curiously. He felt small under their gaze. He didn't belong here. He was just a kid, but to them he was something else. He was a problem. When Officer Turner returned, she had a set of clippers in her hands. "We need to take care of this," she said coldly, pointing at his hair. Tyler's heart sank. He knew exactly what was happening. She was going to shave it off. His beautiful braids, his father's gift to him, were going to be taken away, all because of a false accusation. "Please no," Tyler pleaded, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not in a gang. Please don't do this." But Officer Turner was resolute. She didn't care about his pleas or his innocence. She was following her orders, or at least her own misguided judgment. She began shaving his hair, the buzzing sound filling the room as his braids fell to the floor one by one. Tyler couldn't stop the tears now. It wasn't just about his hair, it was about everything. His dignity, his identity, his father's love, all of it was being stripped away in that cold, sterile room. Each snip of the clippers felt like a deep wound. He could feel his heart breaking with every strand of hair that fell. This was more than just an injustice. It was an attack on who he was. Finally, when the last of his braids was gone, Tyler was left sitting there, his head shaved, his spirit crushed. Officer Turner stood over him, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "You'll learn to keep your hair in check next time," she said, her voice filled with finality. But Tyler didn't respond. His eyes were filled with tears, but he refused to speak. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him broken. He would get through this. He had to. It wasn't the hair that hurt the most. It was the feeling of being judged, of being made to feel like he didn't belong just because of how he looked. His father had always told him that his hair was his crown, and now he was left feeling like nothing more than a victim of a system that couldn't see beyond its own assumptions. In that moment, Tyler realized something. No matter what happened, he would hold on to his dignity. No one could take that from him, not Officer Turner, not anyone. And when his father found out what had happened, things would change. But Tyler knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He was stronger than that. Just as Officer Turner finished shaving off the last of Tyler's braids, the weight of the humiliation settled in. Tyler sat there, his head shaved, feeling more exposed than ever. The buzzing of the clippers stopped, and the room became eerily quiet. The anger, frustration, and confusion swirled inside him, but he couldn't speak. His heart was heavy, and he felt like he had been stripped of something so personal, so important. His identity. Officer Turner stood over him, staring down at her work with a sense of finality. She didn't seem to care about the pain she had caused. In her mind, she had done what was necessary, following her own idea of justice. But Tyler didn't feel like justice had been served. He felt like he had been punished for something he didn't even understand. Then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the silence. "What's going on here?" Tyler's eyes flicked toward the door, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. There, standing in the doorway with a calm yet commanding presence, was Marcus, Tyler's father. Marcus was a man of power and influence in the city. He was a well-known businessman with deep ties to the community, someone who commanded respect wherever he went. He had always been Tyler's rock, the person who made him feel invincible. And now, in this moment, Marcus had arrived like a force of nature, just when Tyler needed him most. Tyler's face immediately lit up when he saw his father. The tension in his chest eased, if only for a moment, as he felt a wave of relief. But he could also see the shift in Officer Turner's demeanor. The moment Marcus walked into the room, everything changed. Marcus didn't waste any time. His eyes locked onto Officer Turner with a piercing gaze. He could tell immediately what had happened, what she had done to his son. He wasn't angry yet, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Tyler could see the realization crossing Officer Turner's face as her eyes widened with recognition. She had no idea who she had just messed with. This wasn't just any ordinary man. This was Marcus Carter, one of the most influential businessmen in the city, someone whose name carried weight in every corner of town. "Marcus Carter," Officer Turner mumbled, her voice faltering slightly as she recognized who he was. It was clear she now understood the gravity of her mistake. Marcus stepped forward, his posture steady and his expression calm, but Tyler could feel the power radiating from him. Marcus was a man who never raised his voice unnecessarily, but his presence alone demanded respect. "What's going on here, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice low and controlled. "Why is my son being treated like this? What right do you have to humiliate him like this?" Officer Turner took a step back, clearly flustered. I thought he was involved in gang activity," she stammered, trying to justify her actions. But it was clear from her tone that she was trying to convince herself more than Marcus. She hadn't expected him to show up, and she certainly hadn't expected to be confronted by someone like him. Marcus didn't let her finish. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Gang activity?" he repeated, his voice sharp but calm. "Is that what you think of my son?" He looked at Tyler for a brief moment, his gaze softening, then turned back to Officer Turner. "You've made a huge mistake, officer. And I don't take these kinds of mistakes lightly." Tyler, still sitting in the chair, watched as his father took control of the situation. He had never seen his dad act this way, calm but firm with a sense of authority that no one could challenge. It made Tyler feel proud but also incredibly relieved. "I'm sorry," Officer Turner muttered, her voice barely audible. She seemed unsure of how to handle Marcus, clearly realizing the depth of her error. Marcus raised a hand to silence her. "I'm not interested in apologies. You've crossed a line here and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Tyler could feel the tension in the room growing, but there was something powerful about his father's presence. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't angry. But his words were firm and they carried weight. "You're not just dealing with some random kid off the street," Marcus continued, his tone unyielding. "This is my son. And you have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll make sure this is handled the right way, but trust me, this won't go unnoticed." Officer Turner, now realizing how out of her depth she was, stood there silently. She had no way to explain herself, no way to justify what she had done. And she knew it. She had messed with the wrong person, and now she would have to face the consequences. "Get my son cleaned up," Marcus ordered, his voice firm but calm. "We're leaving." Tyler couldn't believe what was happening. In just a few moments, his father had completely turned the situation around. Officer Turner, who had been so sure of herself moments ago, was now silent, looking defeated. She knew that Marcus wasn't someone who could be crossed, not in the city, not in any way. Tyler stood up slowly, still processing everything that had happened. His hair, which had meant so much to him, was gone. But his father's presence, his protection, made him feel like he could take on the world again. As they walked out of the room, Tyler looked up at Marcus, who had once again proven to him that family, strength, and dignity could overcome anything. As Marcus stood there, calmly confronting Officer Turner, Tyler could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. His father had always been a man of calm strength, someone who could handle any situation with dignity and control. But now, Marcus was showing just how deep his influence really was. Officer Turner's face was pale, her posture stiff, as she stammered in response to Marcus's questions. She seemed to be trying to hold on to some sense of authority, but it was slipping away fast. Her earlier confidence had completely vanished. The recognition in her eyes when she realized who Marcus was spoke volumes. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Tyler's father to be someone so powerful, someone whose name carried weight in every corner of the city. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were measured and steady, but they cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Do you know who I am, officer?" he asked, his gaze never leaving her face. His calmness was unsettling, a reminder of just how much control he had over the situation. Officer Turner's eyes widened as the realization hit her. "A Marcus Carter?" she stuttered. You're... Her voice trailed off as she tried to come to grips with the fact that she had just humiliated the son of one of the most powerful men in the city. The shock on her face was almost comical, if not for the seriousness of the situation. Marcus didn't let her finish. He stepped closer, his presence undeniable. "Yes, I am," he said firmly. "And you've made a huge mistake, Officer Turner. A mistake that you're going to regret." Tyler could see the change in the officer's demeanor. She had gone from confident and sure of herself to visibly nervous. She shifted her weight, her hands twitching as if she wasn't sure what to do next. She hadn't expected Marcus's power to come into play. But now, it was clear that her actions were about to have serious consequences. Marcus's eyes were steady, his voice unwavering as he spoke. "I've spent years building my business, my reputation, and my connections in this city. I've worked hard to ensure that I'm not someone who can be easily crossed. But you," he paused for a moment, his gaze sharp. "You've just crossed a line. And you will be held accountable for it." Officer Turner took a step back, looking like she had just realized how deep the hole she had dug herself into really was. She was no longer the confident officer in charge, she was just another person who had made a mistake, and a big one at that. "I didn't mean to," she started, but Marcus cut her off. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You didn't mean to? You didn't mean to violate my son's rights, publicly humiliate him and make baseless accusations about him? That's not something that can be brushed off with a simple apology. I've worked too hard for too long to let this go unnoticed." Tyler watched his father, amazed at how he remained composed in the face of what had happened. There was no anger in his voice, no rash decisions. Instead, Marcus was doing what he did best, taking control of the situation and making sure it was handled properly. "Not only will I make sure this is corrected," Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with authority, "but I will ensure that this officer faces the full consequences for her actions. You've hurt my son and you've crossed me. I won't let that go unchallenged." Officer Turner's face flushed with embarrassment, and she took another step back, trying to regain some control of the situation. But it was too late. Marcus had already made it clear that things were going to change, and there was nothing she could do about it now. Marcus turned to Tyler, giving him a reassuring look. "We're going to fix this," he said, his voice softening for a moment. "You don't have to worry about anything. This is going to be taken care of." As they turned to leave, Marcus made one last remark, ensuring that the officer understood the full weight of her mistake. "This isn't just about my son's hair," Marcus said, his tone final. "This is about respect. This is about treating people with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance. You'll learn that the hard way." Tyler couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his father. He knew that Marcus wasn't just standing up for him. He was standing up for something bigger. He was showing Tyler that power didn't come from yelling or using force. It came from the ability to make a statement, to act with purpose and dignity, and to ensure that right was done. As they walked out of the station, Tyler could already feel the weight of the situation lifting off him. His father had stepped in and things were going to be made right. But even more than that, Marcus had shown him what true strength looked like. Not the kind that came from force or anger, but the kind that came from calm, steady resolve, and the knowledge that the right thing would always prevail in the end. The aftermath of Officer Turner's actions came quickly. The police department launched an investigation into her behavior, and the results were undeniable. Her actions had been unjust, biased, and unprofessional. Tyler's father, Marcus, made sure the situation was taken seriously, and soon Officer Turner was suspended while the department reviewed her case. The media caught wind of the story, and it quickly became a public scandal. Officer Turner's reputation, once built on years of service, was destroyed in an instant. Her career, built on years of police work, crumbled under the weight of her prejudice. Public opinion turned against her, and many people questioned how someone like her had been allowed to hold power in the first place. She became the face of everything wrong with racial bias in the police force. Her once sturdy position was now unstable, and she found herself dealing with the consequences of her actions on every front. Friends and colleagues began to distance themselves, and her professional future was uncertain. But it wasn't just Officer Turner who faced consequences. Tyler's life had also been affected in a way that no child should ever experience. The emotional toll of what had happened to him was deep, and the humiliation was hard to shake. Being publicly accused of being involved in something he had no part in left a scar on his self-esteem. Tyler had always been proud of who he was, but that night, his confidence was shaken. However, Marcus, his father, did everything in his power to make sure that Tyler's dignity was restored. Marcus worked tirelessly to correct the damage done to his son's self-worth. He arranged for Tyler to meet with counselors, people who helped him process the pain and humiliation he had experienced. His father made sure that Tyler had the tools to heal, to understand that this moment didn't define who he was, and that his worth was far greater than how one person had treated him. As the days passed, Tyler's confidence began to return. With his father by his side, supporting him every step of the way, Tyler realized that the experience, while painful, was something he could overcome. He learned that he had the power to reclaim his dignity, and it wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. He understood that his value came from within, and he started to embrace that truth more and more. On the other hand, Officer Turner's path toward redemption was only just beginning. Her suspension from the police force wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of a long journey to understand the depth of her prejudice. She had hurt a young boy, and the consequences of that were far greater than she could have imagined. As she sat in the quiet of her home, reflecting on what had happened, she started to see the bigger picture. She had acted out of ignorance and fear, and she had caused harm in the process. Eventually, Officer Turner sought help. She enrolled in a community outreach program designed to combat racial bias, where she began working with people from all walks of life. It was hard at first. She was confronted with the very prejudices she had once held, but slowly she began to understand. She learned how her actions had affected not only Tyler but also the community at large. It wasn't enough to apologize, she had to change. She needed to do the work, both within herself and within the community, to show that she had learned from her mistakes. Meanwhile, Marcus, though initially driven by anger and a desire for justice, began to see the situation differently. While he had wanted to seek revenge, he realized that true change came from confronting ignorance with compassion, not from punishment. He made the decision to not only make sure Tyler's dignity was restored but also to find a way to help Officer Turner see her mistakes and change. He knew that fighting hate with hate only perpetuated the cycle, but confronting it with understanding could break it. Through all of this, Tyler grew as well. What began as a painful experience turned into a turning point in his life. He became an advocate for tolerance, for respect, and for understanding. He realized that, despite the hurt he had endured, he could use his story to teach others about the importance of empathy and fairness. Tyler's journey from humiliation to empowerment was remarkable, and he did so with grace and forgiveness, never allowing bitterness to take root in his heart. The final scene of the story shows Tyler walking alongside his father, their bond stronger than ever. They walked side by side with heads held high, a silent understanding between them. What had happened could not be erased, but they had both learned something important. The power of family, self-respect, and the ability to forgive in the face of injustice was something they now carried with them. Together, they knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would always have each other. Tyler had reclaimed his dignity, not through revenge but through the strength of his character. And in doing so, he had taught those around him, including Officer Turner, that true transformation came not from punishment, but from understanding and change.